Well, welcome back to session 2 of the fine art of reintegration. And just to recap, in session 1, perhaps you're joining us for the first time and missed session 1, but just to recap and to review, we talked about the reintegration bridge. We illustrated reintegration with this bridge, and that there are 4 important stages, to recognize 4 important stages of this bridge. The bridge of reintegration, with these 4 stages of what supports the bridge, of the on-ramp onto the bridge, in other words, life in the correctional institution, the body of the bridge representing, illustrating stage 3, and that is the invaluable, game-changing contribution of a faith community in the reintegration process. And then finally, stage 4 being the off-ramp. And this is the goal of reintegration, is we want to see this healthy, thriving individual integrating back into the community, contributing again back to the community. And we said along this reintegration bridge, a bridge of support, that we want to provide clear and manageable steps of reintegration, that there are 3 invaluable questions to ask. And so today, as we think about this second session, we want to ask the first of these 3 questions that can help to continue to dial in, if you will, healthy reintegration practices. The 3 questions again for reintegration are: where have you been? Where have you been? Secondly, where are you going? And then thirdly, how will you get there? Where have you been? Where are you going? How will you get there? Now think with me about the first question. The first question we want to address today in today's session is the question, where have you been? As you plan and develop your support for your individual, for an individual on parole, the starting place is to have a clear picture of where this individual has been. Now, what that doesn't mean is that you need to know all the intimate details of what this individual's offense was. You know, sometimes I think we can sort of get caught up with, if you will, even all of the gory details of what this person experienced and what this person did. That's not really what we're talking about. Over time, as trust is developed, the individual you support may share more and more of their story with you, and that's fine. But that's not really what we're going for as we're initially asking this question. Now, what it does mean is that the parolee openly tells you what their index offense was. In other words, what did they do that led to their sentencing? And what is it that they were sentenced for? Now, why is this so important? Well, first of all, Better Life actually begins the journey with an offender in the second stage of the bridge. As they first meet with an offender, as an offender asks for Better Life support, we actually begin with what is called a disclosure form. Now, why do we do that? Well, openness, honesty, and disclosure are foundations to growth and healthy reintegration. Now, it almost sounds counterintuitive, but saying what has been done, again, in general terms, is actually the healthiest way to blow up shame and guilt. If an individual is not willing to speak openly about what they have done to trusted people, what led to this place, and this is true for all of us, really, in terms of how all of us engage with life and how we grow, then they either haven't accepted the responsibility for what took place and or are so imprisoned by guilt and shame that they won't be able to move forward. Now, we're not saying that reintegration involves the constant reminder and reinforcement of what has been done, because one of the primary steps of healthy reintegration is helping someone understand that there's so much greater than their mistake or their offense. But it's a starting place for an individual to move forward, and an indication that they are gaining freedom from the shackles of guilt and shame. Guilt and shame grow in the dark, grow in secrecy, and so we want to expose to trusted people again, to trusted people. It's not just like broadcast to everybody, but we want to expose to trusted people what it is that we feel guilt and experience shame from. Now, secondly, this brings up the whole important area, in a way, critical area of restrictions and conditions. It is vital to have clarity around the answer to the question, where have you been? Because depending on what the specific offense, as we often call it, index offense, has been for the individual, there are going to be very specific conditions for parole, for their supervision. Now, a faith community, a mentor, a volunteer needs to be clear on what an individual's conditions of parole are. The last thing we want to do is to have our actions lead to a parolee breaking one of their conditions, which can lead to their having supervision and their parole status revoked, possibly even resentencing, but most often being placed back into a corrections institution for a specific period of time. So let's just zoom out for a moment, and I want to invite you to take a look with me from the 30,000 foot level and to provide context as you process the question with the offender that you support, the parolee that you support, the question, where have you been? In the correctional institution, and so we're in stage 2 of the reintegration bridge. If you picture this, the individual, the offender, is still within the correctional institution. They're looking forward to a positive parole hearing and going under supervision in the community on parole. But in the correctional institution, what is called a correctional plan is developed for each inmate. It outlines treatments and recommendations for rehabilitation. Now, Correctional Service Canada then provides programs to match the needs of the offender and to address the risk of reoffending. Now, this plan serves as a way of measuring, of having some type of measure of the offender's progress and moving ahead and rehabilitating, if you will. Now, before offenders leave prison on a conditional release and go on to parole, they agree to a correctional plan. The correctional plan outlines a risk management strategy for each offender. It specifies the interventions and the monitoring techniques required to address areas associated with the risk to reoffend. The plan usually involves certain restrictions or movements and actions, as well as commitments to participate in constructive activities such as job training and other programs, perhaps addressing areas of addiction and such. Now, since each an offender has different needs and problems, each plan is somewhat unique. Each plan is somewhat different. The plan focuses on the specific issues in each offender's life and draws on a wide network of community support in addressing them. Now, the underlying assumption behind all of this, and this is something to keep in mind, is that people usually turn to crime because of problems in their lives. Again, the importance of the question, where have you been? They turn to crime because of problems in their lives, such as a lack of job skills, substance abuse, and poor control of feelings. Again, everyone's an individual, but this is the underlying assumption. And experience shows that with the right motivation and community support, again, the importance of the faith community, most offenders can make positive changes. The results of the risk assessment, as well as the case management strategy group to which the offender belongs, will determine the nature of the interaction and an appropriate supervision strategy, and will be outlined in this correctional plan. That's a lot of information, but that is a part of what the individual is experiencing within the correction and the pathway, in a sense, the on-ramp as they enter this reintegration bridge. There is work that's being done. There's work that is in process. And there is a measurement of that work, which is, in many cases, going to lead to either a successful or not successful parole experience. So let's just say, an offender has been responsive to the correctional plan, and as a result, they have a positive parole hearing with the Parole Board of Canada. The next step on their journey and over this reintegration bridge is parole, or a period of community supervision. For many parolees, this period begins with a CSC, Correctional Service Canada, halfway house, where there is intentional supervision within this environment. There's different conditions. And during this time of parole, every offender has conditions that they must adhere to. So a part of their parole is that they need to adhere to the conditions of the parole, which are very important for us as faith communities, as mentors and volunteers to be aware of and to keep in mind. Now, there are what are called standard conditions, as I'm sure we can imagine, that really every offender needs to abide by. These are things like they need to report consistently, regularly to their parole officer. They need to obey the law and to keep the peace. They need to not own or possess a weapon. That's a violation. They need to report any change in their family, domestic or financial situations to their parole officer. And sometimes these things can be like red flags, or they can be a important area where support is required. And so there needs to be full disclosure in terms of what's going on in this person's relationship. But then there are what are called specific or special conditions. And some of these special conditions, again, unique to the individual and so often tailored to what this individual's offenses have been. But some of the special conditions are to abstain from the use of drugs and alcohol. Alcohol and drug use, that's going to lead to a violation, to being revoked and sent back to an institution. Requests from the victims of the offender often impose specific special conditions. Often no contact with the victim or the family members, no contact with minors, no access to public spaces, community centers, recreation centers, parks with playgrounds where minors are present unless the offender is supervised. Now, of course, this is very important in the context of faith community interaction and with what is often called the community's specific plan to protect those within the community, maybe children, minors, families, vulnerable people, to have that plan in place, both for the community but also for the offender. Often, depending again on the offense of the individual, there's no phone use, there's no cell phone access. Again, this is offense specific, or access to the internet. And you can just imagine for a moment, well, what would life be like with no cell phone? What would life be like with no internet? And you're trying to find a job these days and that kind of thing. And yet, because of the offense, because of the concern that this individual does not reoffend, these restrictions, these conditions are placed on them. And again, as a faith community, as mentors, as volunteers, we need to be very aware. We need to know through disclosure of this offender telling their story, where have I been, what these conditions are, because we don't want them to revoke and to be sent back to an institution. And again, if these conditions of parole are not met, the Parole Board of Canada has the power to revoke the parole and to return the offender to prison. Now, let me just give a practical example of this. It's like, well, how does this work out exactly? But I had a conversation with a faith community staff member who was giving leadership to providing reintegration support. And an offender entered parole and under supervision was attending the faith community, serving in a specific area, and was to begin attending a small group, one of the regular small groups within this church. Now, the staff member asked me the question, how much do we tell the group leaders about this offender's past? We don't want to break the offender's trust. Now, my response to such a question was and is, without question, the group leaders need to know where this person has been. You don't tell their story. We don't tell their story, but we join the offender as they tell their story. Now, I say it as strongly as this. In reintegration, trust needs to be earned. Trust needs to be earned. Now, let me be clear. You may think, well, that's so harsh. Like, what kind of a position is this? What about believing the best about people? This person has committed an offense. And we want the best for this individual. And so I don't say this to be punitive. I say this because of the realities of the offender's issues. Full disclosure, again, to trusted people, and the resulting guardrails aren't punitive. They are protective. They are going to provide safety for the offender and for the community. That is always, always, always our goal. And perhaps you have questions about this, perhaps you have experiences about this that you'd like to share. But I'd like to invite you, if you're watching this online and you have questions about specifics, how does this work out, please email me your questions. And I'd love to interact with you around this, again, at adam.betterlife@gmail.com. Well, before we leave this area of answering the question, where have you been? I'd like you to think with me for a moment about the environment an offender is coming from. The environment of a correctional institution isn't necessarily like you see on some dramatic Netflix or Amazon Prime show, but sadly, it can be. A typical day for an offender looks like this, and it follows the routine of the institution. Now, this routine is based on an institution's security classifications. And so you may well know that there are these different classifications in an institution. There's maximum, where there's obviously more restrictions. There's medium, and then there is minimum. And it even varies from institution to institution what the restrictions, what the environment is like. There's different classifications even within a maximum, a minimum, and a medium institution. And so just some things to be aware of. But a typical offender's day goes like this. Just take a look for a moment of this day. So 6:45, right? It's like, oh, okay, inmate count. 7 o'clock, breakfast. It's like, normal day. 8 o'clock, go to a program, go to work, or go back to your cell or your room. Again, cell or room, depending on what security of an institution you're in. 11:45, return to the cell or room for an inmate count and lunch. 13, go to the program, go to work, go back to the cell or the room. 16:30, return to the cell or room for inmate count and then supper. 1800 hours, go to recreation, cultural events, self-help groups, etc. And it may sound like, wow, recreation, self-help groups, cultural events. It's like, it's not quite what it sounds like, but there are these opportunities to engage. It may be cultural events, even watching television, but it may be also going to chapel, being a part of a purpose-driven life or something along those lines, an alpha group, what have you. And so those typically take place during this time. At 22:30, there's the night inmate count, and then 2300, there's the lockup and lights out. Now, informal inmate counts also take place several times during the day, through the day, without interrupting activities. So there's always sort of this vigilance that's going on. You know you're being watched. During the night, correctional officers make regular rounds to ensure that inmates are safe in their cells or rooms between lockup and morning count. Now, just think of this for a moment from the perspective of your life and the freedom that you have. An offender has a very regimented life. There's not a lot of freedom. There's not a lot of choices, again, depending on the security clearance of the institution. It's invaluable to keep that in mind as you provide support. You may wonder at times, what is up with this individual? They can't make up their mind. They can't make the most simple decisions. And the fact is, depending on the length of time you're within an institution, depending who the individual is, it's very easy for some people to become what is called institutionalized. The fact is, coming out of a correctional institution can be very overwhelming for an offender. They get used to this regimented life. You know what's going to happen next. In many cases, there's this routine that's just, in a sense, you enter into it. Here you go. You do this, you do this, you do this. You take this step, you take this step, you take this step. Not a lot of thought, not a lot of decision. And many of the men and women, surprisingly, when you think about it, tell us that the most frightening time that they have in this whole process of offending and being a part of a correctional environment, the most frightening time is the day that they are released. There are the questions of whether or not they'll actually make it. How are they going to make it? And those questions may not have anything to do with a fear of offending, but rather these enormous practical questions of where will I live? What will I eat? How will I get food? How in the world do I use a cell phone? Now, we'll talk about some of these in more detail as we look at the next two questions in the sessions to come. Where am I going and how will I get there? And we also need to note that there can be, sadly, a lot of trauma that offenders experience in prison. There are gangs in prison. There's bullying. There's exploitation. There's abuse. In many ways, it's like the school playground that some people experience with, the bullies and the cliques and all these different things that are interacting around the offender's experience. It varies from prison to prison, but prison can be a very traumatic experience on top of whatever the experience is that led up to the individual's offense, what their background was like, and the committing of their offense. It is not uncommon for an offender to come out of prison with serious PTSD. And I think perhaps one of the most graphic pictures I can give you this, of course, there's all the shows on TV, which are somewhat based in reality. I mean, they're trying to make a good, interesting TV show, but some of those situations are based in reality. But Hank Dixon's book is invaluable to give you insight into what is a individual's experience, an offender's experience within a prison. And Hank looks at it both as being a lifer in prison himself, as an inmate, but then as a chaplain, and gives us that unique perspective. Now, I raise these issues because it is sometimes difficult to understand, or at the very least surprising to support someone that can seem so paralyzed at times, or at the very least doesn't seem able to take simple steps that many of us take for granted. When we ask the question, where have you been? And we begin to understand some of the factors that have impacted the offender we support, it helps us to be compassionate and empathetic and proactive in providing support in such a way that helps the offender begin to trust. And with that foundation of trust, begin to take healthy steps forward. Thank you for joining us for session 2 as we ask and think about this question, the important question of where have you been?